Hello, I'm the UK Angry Atheist. This is the second part of my film looking at God's compassionate, caring nature. In the first part I talked about my father and his long battle with Alzheimer's disease, and I told you about some of the horrific consequences of getting Alzheimer's disease, and I asked you to consider, does that marry up with a loving and caring, compassionate God? What I didn't tell you about Alzheimer's disease is that it's actually a terminal illness. A lot of people don't realise that, but in actual fact it is. It's always fatal. If another illness doesn't get you first, such as something like a heart attack, then Alzheimer's disease will kill you every time. Usually this is due to the failure of the swallow reflex, which means that people, when they're given something to eat or drink, aspirate the food, i.e. inhale it into the lungs and choke, and this usually leads to pneumonia. Obviously that's very distressing for people around, and obviously for the person that's been given food and drink. And that's actually what happened to my father in the end. He got to the stage where he could no longer take food or drink without choking, and he actually developed pneumonia. In UK law, suicide is no longer illegal. However, assisting somebody else to commit suicide is still a criminal offence. So much so that in recent past, people have been investigated by the police with a view to prosecution because they've gone with relatives abroad to end their life. Countries like Switzerland and Holland have a far more liberal view to assisted dying, and there's, for instance, an organisation in Switzerland called Dignitas, and people have gone from the UK to end their lives there, people with terminal illnesses, and we have had instances where relatives coming back into the UK after accompanying a loved one on the final trip abroad, as it were, have been arrested and investigated for assisting with a suicide. My understanding is the Director of Public Prosecutions has now ruled that that's usually not grounds for a prosecution, but it is a kind of grey area still. However, in the UK we're very good at fudges for difficult situations, and one fudge we do have is that it's not seen as a criminal offence to withhold treatment from somebody who's terminally ill. And treatment can include nutrition. This regime is usually called the Liverpool Care Pathway. The Liverpool Care Pathway is designed basically to avoid suffering at the end of somebody's life. And when somebody's placed on the Liverpool Care Pathway, they're prescribed various drugs by the doctor, including morphine for pain relief and medication to give sedation if somebody's becoming very agitated, and in the case of my father he also had some medication there to stop secretions of fluid because he was getting fluid on his lungs. And the aim of this is to ease suffering, which in principle sounds good. However, it doesn't always work like that. You see, the Liverpool Care Pathway is fine for people who are fully cognitively intact, who perhaps have a cancer or something and are dying, because they can ask for pain relief. They can tell the nurse who's in attendance that they're actually suffering from pain, and they can ask to be given pain relief usually. Somebody who's got dementia may not be able to do that, and so they're reliant upon the discretion of the nurse to agree that pain relief is necessary. And in my experience, this doesn't happen always. My father was put on the Liverpool Care Pathway, and I was assured at the time that he wouldn't suffer, but that wasn't the case. It took 7 days for the dehydration and lack of food to kill him, and in that time he refused morphine on 2 occasions. Obviously my father didn't ask for the morphine. We could see my father was distressed, and we presumed suffering from the effects of dehydration, and we called for the district nurses to attend and to give morphine. And on both occasions the district nurses came along, asked my father was he suffering, which was ludicrous because my father couldn't communicate verbally, he'd not been able to communicate for weeks, well, months. And when he didn't reply, and because they couldn't observe suffering in their eyes, they refused. There is a background to this. We had a famous serial killer a number of years ago in the UK called Dr. Harold Shipman, and his modus operandi was to visit patients of his who were perhaps older in years, although not with dementia, and to give them large doses of diamorphine or morphine because he got some sort of kick out of taking life. Because of this, and perhaps more importantly because of the interest of Christian and pro-life groups around euthanasia, the police are quite active at looking into people's deaths, and medical practitioners, nurses and so on have become a little bit paranoid about giving controlled drugs like morphine to people that are terminally ill, because they're worried that they could be scrutinised later and accused of giving the drugs to promote death rather than to relieve pain. One high profile campaigner, I should add, is the author Terry Pratchett. He's made several films and spoken out in other media such as on the radio and on the internet regarding the right to die, because Mr. Pratchett, unfortunately, like my father, has Alzheimer's disease, and he's well aware that should he get to the point where he can no longer swallow, his end could be like my father's. And because of this high profile campaign, and because of the backlash from the pro-life movement, it's my assertion that the nurses that attended my father were scared to give morphine without my father explicitly saying he was suffering pain. And this position is a fudge, because once the decision's been made to put somebody on the end-of-life pathway, the outcome's never in doubt. If you withdraw fluids and food from somebody, you know they're going to die. It's inevitable. It is euthanasia. And so why are we so worried that we speed that process up by giving doses of morphine? It doesn't make any sense to me. In fact, why do we make people suffer that in any case? If we made the decision that we're no longer going to give them fluids, then we have given them a death sentence. And it's just the speed and the way of death that's different. My father, as I say, he lived for 7 days, and during that time my mother and I watched him dehydrate, we watched his skin go yellow and waxy, we watched him fighting for breath, we saw his lips cracking, we saw his throat red and raw, we could hear his breath rasping, his temperature soared. It was horrific. You know, the only thing I can think of that was similar was the things we heard of from Belsen and Dachau and the Nazi death camps. You know, that sort of treatment is just torture. You know, to my mind, my father was tortured to death. And why? Because at the end of the day, his life was terminated, but because of the pressure from Christians and pro-lifers, nobody could do that humanely. As my mother said at the time, watching him die, you couldn't do this to a dog. You'd be had up in court if you treated a dog like this, and yet, as she put it, a good man who's never hurt anybody has to go through this. It's just not fair. And she's right, it's not fair, it's not moral, it's amoral, And it's an amoral position that we've come to because of the pressures of Christian pro-lifers and do-gooders who can't see beyond what it says in some ancient book. It's not an easy position to be in, but to kill older people, vulnerable people in this way is barbaric. And if people could see this, could see how people die, there'd be no objections to euthanasia, controlled euthanasia, like similar to the systems in Switzerland and Holland. People would want that because this is cruel, barbaric and wrong. And it's another result of Christian meddling in public policy. Thank you.